Ever since the Star Wars sequel trilogy came out, a bitter debate in the fan base has ensued over which movie was the worst. Kind of like what people did with the prequels once upon a time. And while answers may vary wildly depending on who you ask, with some people saying The Last Jedi is the best, and others saying it's the worst thing in Star Wars, period, and other people saying that The Rise of Skywalker is so badly written that it makes everything look better by comparison. And for the sake of being objective, I'm not going to argue that any of these opinions are wrong. I'm just noting that they are extremely different. But today, I would like to focus on one specific school of thought when it comes to the sequel trilogy, which is specifically the camp that believes The Rise of Skywalker is a better movie than The Last Jedi, or at least that the movie is better in comparison to it, and try to explain why exactly it is they feel that way. Because at first glance, it would seem that even if one hates The Last Jedi, anybody should be able to concede that it's a better made movie. So how could anyone possibly say that The Rise of Skywalker is better? And obviously there will be spoilers ahead for anything and everything Star Wars, so in case you're not completely caught up on something movie-wise and don't want anything ruined, I wouldn't recommend proceeding with this video. Okay, so as I just went over moments ago, everybody is entitled to their own opinion when it comes to how they feel about the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And I would just like to stress that this video is simply to explain the thought process behind some of those opinions, and not to argue for whether or not they are actually the right ones. But that being said, it is true that many think that The Rise of Skywalker is actually a better movie than The Last Jedi, and for those same people, that mainly comes down to a few different factors, with the first one simply being that they simply hate The Last Jedi so much that they would enjoy anything that wasn't like it. And considering the fact that The Rise of Skywalker actively tries to undo the events of The Last Jedi, if not really succeeds at it, that only makes some appreciate it even more. But for a more in-depth reason as to why some might prefer the third movie over the second, there's also the treatment of the characters. Because the number one complaint among many Star Wars fans when it comes to The Last Jedi is that they feel it treats the older George Lucas characters disrespectfully. And it's not impossible to see where they're coming from. Luke Skywalker's portrayal was infamously controversial, to say the least, with many believing that it was perhaps the biggest disservice done to a character in all of cinema. C-3PO is completely useless and, in the words of Anthony Daniels himself, little more than a table decoration. Chewbacca is reduced to being harassed by alien birds, despite the fact that in story he just lost his lifelong friend only days earlier, and Admiral Akbar is blasted out into space and killed without any fanfare in a move that many felt was extremely unnecessary. And even the characters that are given more respect don't have it much better, as Leia spends most of the movie in a coma, and her plan to rescue the Resistance turns out to be, shall we say, not a very good one, and not to mention, because of Carrie Fisher's death, this is the last time she'd ever get to act in anything, period, and Yoda is left to be nothing but a messenger to deliver Rian Johnson's moral across to the audience. And many think it was not one that Luke had to learn a second time. My point is, many felt that The Last Jedi was a major disservice to the characters that they knew and loved from the original trilogy, which is a major reason that they hated it with such a burning passion. The Rise of Skywalker, however, is nowhere near as guilty of this, and if anything, might just treat the old characters the best out of any of the movies in the sequel trilogy for what it's worth. Because while there aren't many of them left, it feels like this movie makes at least an attempt to do right by the ones they do have. For example, Chewbacca's death scene is actually treated as a big deal and given fanfare, and then it turns out that he didn't even die. Again, it may not be written too well, but after the way the previous two movies killed off beloved characters indiscriminately, one can appreciate a bait and switch like that. And this time, C-3PO is actually given a very important part to play in the plot, to the point that many say he's the standout of the movie, with him similarly having to pull a sacrifice that's later reversed. Again, narrative-wise, it's not great, but after the previous two movies, it is acceptable to many a fan. And Lando, though not given much to do, is treated with a lot of gravitas, regarded as a big deal and pillar of wisdom, and is even allowed to survive the movie with his dignity intact, having actually helped them to win the day. Now, that might sound pathetic and like it should have been a given, but for the third time, after what some of the other characters went through, it's at least something. And the same goes for Luke, who many believe in his one scene is treated with more respect than in the entirety of The Last Jedi, even if it's not nearly enough to undo the damage many felt that movie did to him. And even though Carrie Fisher died, they still used the archived footage they had for all it was worth to give Princess Leia something resembling a proper send-off. And honestly, most are willing to give them more leeway in this regard anyway, because they were dealing with limited footage and went out of their way to put her in the movie in the first place, even though it would have been easier to kill her off-screen between movies. And finally, they even retroactively managed to make Han Solo's death actually mean something by having him appear as a hallucination to Kylo Ren to convince him to redeem himself. And it may just be the one moment in the movie that actually manages to strike an emotional chord with people. Again, it can't make up for his arguably disrespectful death, but at least here he's given more of the respect he deserves. And even the Emperor, though not written the best, is definitely treated as a threat worth being afraid of, even if he probably shouldn't have been there in the first place. The point is, unlike The Last Jedi, which many felt was very disrespectful to the older characters, The Rise of Skywalker at least feels like it tries to do right by them. And even if it doesn't make up for what came before, to those same people, that can make the movie more tolerable for them than The Last Jedi. Because it feels like it was at least trying to be respectful towards them. It can make it a little easier for them to sit through it. And for a third reason, it simply makes for a good action movie, especially in comparison to The Last Jedi. Because that movie is trying to be way too much at once. It honestly doesn't have much in the way of those grand, epic Star Wars battles until the final third. And even then, it can feel like the action is stretched out for far too long. In other words, it feels like it's trying to be The Empire Strikes Back, but doesn't have anything interesting to say, which can make it pretty boring. But one thing people can't say The Rise of Skywalker doesn't have is a fast pace. Because they're trying to cover so much in only 2 hours, the movie goes at a breakneck speed through everything. And honestly, It makes for a pretty good adrenaline rush. And if that's what one is looking for in a movie, then The Rise of Skywalker would honestly be perfect for them. And again, that's why some are inclined to prefer it over The Last Jedi. Because even if it isn't that good, it at least makes for a good dumb action movie, while The Last Jedi doesn't even have that to offer in addition to everything else. Now listen, none of this is to say that The Rise of Skywalker is actually a good movie, because I'll be the first person to say it. As a man who's written books, this is most definitely not what the finale of a long-running series should look like. Because it might be heavy on action, but its story makes no sense, it plays way too fast and loose with the lore, and ends with a conclusion that satisfied basically no one. But even with all of that, my only point here is that some people still think it's better than The Last Jedi, which should honestly be a testament to just how much those people hated that movie. Because here's the thing, both The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker arguably make for bad Star Wars movies to many people, but The Last Jedi feels, whether it actually is or not, like it's going out of its way to be disrespectful and insulting to Star Wars fans, while The Rise of Skywalker, again, whether it actually is or not, at least feels like it's trying to be respectful, and that its many mistakes come across more as the writers having no idea what they're doing, rather than a deliberate attempt to screw with the fans. So as a result, the people who feel this way are more inclined to be forgiving of The Rise of Skywalker because they believe it at least put in the effort to make a good movie, even if it failed miserably, unlike The Last Jedi, which, justified or not, could feel like a straight-up attack on Star Wars and its fans. And honestly, the same can be said for the Star Wars prequels as well. Because while the sequel trilogy is definitely better made in technical regards, such as dialogue, the prequels tell a more coherent story, and on the whole just feel a lot more like Star Wars to many fans. And as I explained in my video on cult movies, which you can find a link in the description to, sometimes the pinnacle of quality isn't what an audience is looking for when they go to watch something, especially in the case of Star Wars. Because sure, ideally a fan wants both quality and that Star Wars feeling, but if they have to choose between a movie that isn't made so well in the conventional sense, but feels perfectly like Star Wars, or a better made movie that feels nothing like Star Wars at all, then most will pick the former every time. Because obviously what they love most about Star Wars is that it feels like Star Wars. Which is why many a fan will say they prefer the prequels to the sequels. Because to them, they might not be as good technically, but they are still genuine, bona fide Star Wars movies. Whereas the sequels feel completely artificial and sometimes downright insulting to what Star Wars is supposed to be. And all of this also applies to a lesser extent with The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. Because again, despite its extremely amateur mistakes, The Rise of Skywalker at least feels like it's trying to be a Star Wars movie and be respectful, even if it arguably doesn't succeed all that well, while The Last Jedi to many fans simply feels like a malicious attack on the franchise they love. Again, whether it was meant to be that way or not. And not to mention, as I touched on before, if nothing else, at least The Rise of Skywalker works as a good adrenaline rush. And for that reason alone, some might be more inclined to favor it over its predecessor. Because to many people, The Last Jedi pretty much fails on every level and has nothing to offer in place of that, while The Rise of Skywalker at least has a wild, action-filled ride to offer in place of its other flaws. And as I said in the aforementioned video, sometimes people will enjoy something that's fun over something that's made better but is also boring. And both the prequels and The Rise of Skywalker have this advantage when it comes to being compared to The Last Jedi for many people. Because, to put it simply, as I've said many times in my personal life, The Rise of Skywalker makes for a bad Star Wars movie, and even movie in general, but it does make for a good action movie. And the same cannot be said for many people in any regard when it comes to The Last Jedi. Alright, I think I've made my point with all of this. So now I'd like to hear from you guys. Do you believe that The Rise of Skywalker is actually better than The Last Jedi? Or do you believe that The Last Jedi is the superior movie? Or do you not like either of them or the sequel trilogy in general? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. But please let's try and keep it civil here. I just want to have a conversation with all of you, not have my comment section turn into a war zone over this. And let me just once again emphasize that I was merely explaining why some people feel about these movies the way they do, and that they aren't necessarily my own thoughts on the subject, nor was I trying to argue for why their opinion was the right one. As I said at the beginning, you are most definitely entitled to your own opinion on this subject, and if you disagree with the ones expressed in this video, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.